Welcome everybody to the first meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium of the fall 2016 year. We had a great colloquium last spring and we're very excited to get it restarted with a brand new set of presentations. I'm Emily Henkin-Ritter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced, and I have been appointed as the coordinator of online speaker series for the Peace Science Society International. And so this colloquium, in case you're new to us, is a series of presentations focusing on different studies related to peace science and conflict in a more general sense and violence. And so I have put together a set of presentations of working papers to try and advertise this work and research by great scholars and to talk more about peace science and to get great feedback for these papers to make sure that we get as much peace science scholarship published as we possibly can, right? Put it in a great place to be published. So today we have our first presentation from Anita Kellogg, who is a PhD candidate at UCLA. And she will be giving a presentation today. We are joined by discussants, Andrew Enterline, who's an associate professor at the University of North Texas, Curtis Bell, who is a research assistant, a visiting scholar at University of Colorado Boulder, as well as a research associate at the One Earth Future organization. We have Gabriele Spilker, who is an assistant professor at the University of Salzburg, and Melda Ozsut, who is a graduate student at the University of North Texas, and they will be providing comments for us today. So welcome. Thank you guys for reading the paper, and we're very excited to have you all here. So we'll start with a presentation from Anita that will run about 15 minutes, and that way anybody who hasn't read the paper can get a sense of what's going on in this research, and then we will open it up for discussion. If anyone who is viewing live would like to ask a question during the presentation, there is a Q&A option available on the Google Hangout. And so you should be able to, we've not tried this before, but you should be able to ask questions that we would see during this conversation. And so people who are watching can also ask things. So give it a try. If it doesn't work, let me know and we'll figure it out for the next time. All right, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Anita, who's going to share her slides so we can get started.
Okay.
Great, looks great.
So you see the slides?
Yes, that's
okay. Perfect. I'm using two monitors and it's oh, I see it. Sorry, I apologize.
No
All right, so as you can see, the paper title is When It Is Not Business as Usual, Petro-States and International Conflict. So recently, international relations has begun to address this question as why are petro-states more aggressive in initiating international conflict? And existing explanations have focused on the nature of the oil exports themselves. My argument that I'll present today looks at the particular political economy that dependence on oil creates in a given smaller and less influential private sector and how that affects the likelihood of using military force to settle disputes. So to kind of give you a picture of this causal argument, we begin with the natural resource curse, which is basically, it tells us about the private sector. I'll go into a little detail why, but this creates a smaller private sector that has less influence. And I guess I probably should start with, in terms of economic interdependence, the idea that reduces conflict is based on the idea that the businesses and economic interest groups that would be affected have some ability to influence government leaders when making those decisions. But in this case, in oil-dependent states, foreign policy is not driven by commercial incentives, and this results in an increased willingness to use military force to settle disputes. Okay, so the smaller private sector size is a result of two things, and one is called the resource movement effect, and that's as the resource sector booms, it draws labor and capital away from agricultural and manufacturing sectors, which also raises their production costs. The spending effect is as money from the booming resource sector enters the economy, it raises the real exchange rate. Thus, a higher exchange rate makes it cheaper to import agricultural goods and manufactured goods than to produce them domestically, and it also increases the price of exports. So essentially, that leads to a deindustrialization of oil-dependent states. In terms of influence, it's important to realize that since the 70s, most of these oil-dependent states have a nationalized oil sector, which gives the state itself control over those resources. And this has a lot of implications for, not dependent on a tax revenue base, but it also has a really important implication for businesses. So in deindustrialized society, what remains of private sector tends to be in services, and they are catering mostly to the state as their client. So their success is not based on economic competition, but access to state resources. So in an interview that I did with Gabriele who was the former Venezuela trade minister, I was talking to her about the relationship between the private sector and the government, she was like, essentially, there's no competition, and they were just beggars. We were the people who had all the money, and for them to they were just fighting to get our attention. So I look at the interaction of private sector on economic interdependence on conflict, and my argument depends on the fact that economic interdependence should not be effective in oil states because of the small private sector size and influence. But first, here's a table that just gives you some ideas, gives you a sense of, what states we're talking about. So we find the effect that I'm about to show you in about 20 to 30%, which kind of makes some sense. And, basically a lot of these, a few are surprising, but a lot of these give you some idea where, how dependent states are. So the first looks at sort of the logit model that is common in the literature, and it's important in defining conflict in the sense that this is about using military force, and one of the ways to distinguish high-level disputes, and as typical, is militarized disputes with fatalities. And the key independent variables are bilateral trade, oil independence, and then it has the other important factors of conflict and controls for a temporal spine. So here are this is how oil dependence affects the impact of economic interdependence on these conflicts. And so we can see that economic interdependence is still pacifying with dyads whose states are less than 20%. This is representative of the state in a dyad that is most oil dependent. But then we start to certainly reduce that specific effect. It is no longer significant once we get into dyads that have a state with 20 or 30% dependent. There's a lot of problems with this model, and I actually like this next model better, but it's been difficult to do like two-stage models with economic interdependence because just no one has good identifying restrictions. They usually almost always, because conflict and trade are generated essentially or have by a lot of the same variables, and no one ever gets, I don't know, uses a variable that you can't theoretically argue that is probably affecting both sides. But in a recent article, and I'm going to forget the name because it's not in front of me, but Vance and somebody, we're taking this two-part model out of economics, and essentially you don't have identifying restrictions. And the good thing about the two-part model is we don't lose all that information that we did by only looking at militarized disputes with fatalities. We look here at all disputes and then calculate a hostility level. So the MIDs themselves rate hostility on a 1 to 5 basis. But some people use like the highest number in the dispute, but the problem with that is you have a lot of disputes that are categorized as 4-1, which is sort of like one state crosses the border going after drug traffickers, and then the other state responds with like a diplomatic sort of thing. So on this interval scale, you actually, it includes number of fatalities, and it goes from 0 to 100. So in the two-part model, we begin with the logit model on the probability of having a dispute in the first place. And I obviously didn't put the table in a presentation like this, but essentially we find that economic interdependence and this interaction doesn't affect whether there is a militarized dispute. And in the case that I'm going to show you, that's not too surprising. So in fact, I think that the evidence is more convincing in the sense that the same level of, the same number of disputes occur, the same reasons are still there, but these economic incentives or the lack of them alter whether they become militarized or not. So the second part of that is a regression model on the hostility level, the dispute. So here we can see the effect of oil dependence on economic interdependence, and we start seeing the effects. Here we lose the Pacific effects at 30% dependent. So one of the problems in the literature is that we have all these quantitative models, but even with this model that starts to get beyond the black box and incorporate some of this domestic process, I mean, we still don't have, we need more evidence of the actual causal pathway. So present one case study of the Colombia-Venezuela rivalry, which looks at the private sector relationship with Venezuela and how that affects this rivalry with Colombia. So something to know about this overall relationship is that in about 1988, the two countries almost went to war in the Gulf of Venezuela. And really their whole navies were out there, and it became very close, and the OAS negotiated the settlement. So at this time in 89, 90 was part of the time that a lot of Latin America were starting to shift away from import substitution to opening their economies. So Venezuela and Colombia were also natural trading partners. They have over 1,000 long border, and they also, it's notable, they also saw this as a way of reducing this conflict that had really, this only shows to 80, but had been just a really prevalent part of their relationship. So, so you can see that trade grows a lot, and you still have a lot of low-level MIDs in this period, but instead of using military force, even in a limited way, things are resolved usually through diplomatic measures. Essentially, they might recall a diplomat for a month, but then the two leaders would get together and say trade is the most important thing, and they would resolve. And then another important thing to keep in mind in this is how important these two countries were in developing they're non-commodity markets, so they're light manufacturing, because most of them, both Colombia and Venezuela, remain primarily commodity exporters, but to each other, they were also building up this manufacturing capability. Colombia would send like car parts to Venezuela, which were assembled there. And sort of also when I'm talking about why is the political economy and not the exports itself, is here we can see that despite some people, even some Colombians I talked to, Venezuela did not actually export much oil after liberalization. So there are actually two incidents that sort of portray the variation and in conflict in Venezuela. So early in Chavez's tenure, he was still trying to work with the business community. He, in general, in all of his decisions, Danielle Campella makes this point as well, that he was acting economically rational. And so in 2001, there was arrest of a FARC member, high-level FARC member, of Jose Moret Balestas, and this became controversial because he was, just as he was getting on the plane to be exported to Colombia, Chavez just like kicked him off the plane, and so Colombia was like, "What's going on?" And then he dropped all charges. Then he put charges on, returned, but. So obviously Colombia was very unhappy, and throughout this whole point, you know, though both leaders kept saying, "Oh, but we need to prioritize trade. That's the most important thing." And it eventually, in December, he was eventually extradited to Colombia. But by December 2004, Chavez had made a number
2
of
minutes, Anita.
Okay, had made a number of constitutional changes and sorry, distracted. So constitutional changes, and there was the business strike, which he defeated. He fired 20,000, which was half of the state oil company, for being disloyal, and essentially business was completely depleted of any access to the government at this point. In 2004, another member of FARC, Ritter, Granada, was apprehended and transported to Colombia. And this was the first time in protest, Chavez cut off trade for 2 weeks. And this is the first time trade was actually made this political issue. And if you cut off trade, it's sort of the same economic logic as if you were going to use military force, right? So he does this many times. By 2009, they're close to war again, and it actually ends he cuts off trade for like 9 months, and this essentially ends their interdependence overall. So, you know, to wrap up, it's this smaller private sector as a result of oil dependence that removes the constraints, the economic constraints on using military force. Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's open it up for comments from our discussants. So anyone who would like to get us started?
I guess I could go first.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to thank Anita. I really enjoyed reading this paper. It's very nicely done, and made me think a lot, so that's a good sign. I'm more on the IR side. I don't study resources as part of my research, but it did make me think. And the thing that I thought about was that many of your examples are really contemporary examples. And I'm sort of curious because I'm old now, and I was in high school during the Reagan administration, about the Cold War. Many of these Petro-States that are in Table 1, the usual suspects, were sort of creatures of the superpower rivalry. And so they were Petro-States, but they were kind of special. They were very militarized, even though they weren't very industrial. And they were fighting a lot. And then the Cold War ends, and states like Libya, for example, are suddenly very different. So I was wondering, in your analysis, which I couldn't tell, I assume the capitalist peace data set is post-World War II.
Yeah, I use the post-World War II.
Right. There's a lot of activity in that period that's hard to sort of separate out. And I wondered, in sort of the Petro connection here with militarized conflict, if you saw any differences there when the Cold War ends.
I did use, it's not reflected in the models, I did look at decade controls, and it was consistent, but I would definitely go back and look at that again and maybe even include that.
Well, one thing you might do is maybe show an appendix that shows the combatants, like which of these Table 1 states are the primary fighters, and that might give the reader a sense of that side of the equation. So I thought that might be interesting because a lot changed there.
Andy, Gabriele has a question, and then we'll come back to you. That's okay. Gabriele?
Yeah, okay. So thanks, Anita, for this fantastic paper and the great presentation. On the question of timing brought up by Andrew, I have something that I'm not completely clear about the causal story of your argument, is that for me it makes sense, the argument makes sense as a cross-sectional argument. So if you compare Petro-States that have where the resource curves set in, and then you have the private sector that does not play any role anymore. So there the story makes sense to me. But then you have Petro-States over time, and their oil dependency varies, kind of. But why should it matter? And in your analysis, this is where you kind of leverage your, where some effects might come from. You see that, I mean, also for the argument for Venezuela, the case illustrates this. So why should it matter that if I turn from 30 to 40% of oil dependency, why should I suddenly fight more or less wars? That doesn't become, I mean, so, so there's one switch from no oil dependency to oil dependency makes a lot of sense to me. But any kind of variation in oil dependency and how this affects the decision to go to war, I have trouble understanding the connection, because for me, it's a one-time shot. Either the private sector is out and then it probably stays out, or it's in. But the private sector's involvement won't matter whether we have an oil dependency of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70.
I think you're right about some of that. I certainly did a dyad where it was just oil states, and I can definitely bring that back in. That's certainly the approach Colgan takes. I like also doing it this way because there is some variation over periods, right? So states can do things where when oil price is low for a long period of time, not just temporarily, because people keep trying to like the price now, and I feel like it's very mixed, right? Because we see Russia maintain military spending even as the oil price is low. But when oil price was low for a long time in the 80s, you see a lot of countries trying to diversify their sectors, and even though private sector is still small and influential, that there could possibly be some effect. But I definitely think that's a good point, and certainly the results were even stronger when I ran it with the dyad. So,
Gabby?
This gets you an alternative explanation, no? So you currently do not talk much about oil prices, but if the price of oil fluctuates, this would maybe point to another explanation, probably the one that leaders have more resources available and can buy off potential rivals, which would maybe point more to the Colgan story. But I mean, I just think you might want to be clearer on this. And it's great that you just say that your arguments, the results are even stronger, because that points in your direction or your favor.
Yeah. So yeah, that's something that I can definitely incorporate pretty easily. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Curtis, and then Melda.
Yeah, Anita, nice to meet you, and thanks for the paper. Really interesting stuff. One one thing that I'd really like to see more of is more attention to, and I think this is building off the previous point, more attention to how a history of conflict can create oil dependence. We know that many MIDs occur not in isolation, but as part of historical rivalries, so that the same dyads are coming into conflict many times. And is it possible that previous conflicts are causing oil dependence to some extent? This might be a mechanism that complements the Dutch mechanism that you talk about.
Well, can I ask a question about that? So this is part of this paper comes out of my larger dissertation project that's seen many iterations, and I originally wanted a more medium N, but that I wanted to graduate. So, but when I was looking at that, I was really focusing on strategic rivalries. And so I've done a lot of research, and certainly the Colombia-Venezuela case study comes from when I was working out of that, chosen from that. But when I kind of came to oil, that wasn't originally part of the dissertation, and sort of developed as I was thinking about this argument and listening and reading to Colgan and others, and just sort of like having thought about this case study with Venezuela. Certainly, the changes in the political economy in Venezuela go back to the 40s. And so I've read some interesting history there, but I'm not sure I understand how conflict itself leads to oil dependence. I mean, because that seems like it's usually like having oil in the country and how you're going to, use those resources. I haven't come across anything, but maybe you can tell me, because I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah, the idea here would be that it isn't only the presence of oil wealth that can lead to oil dependence and limited development of other sectors of the economy. It's also that histories of conflict might dissuade foreign direct investment or suppress other kinds of industries to the point that an economy becomes overly dependent on oil.
Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. I mean, Michael Ross had a paper recently with, I'm really bad at names. I cannot remember the second. It's terrible. It's terrible. I know who he is. He's a big IR guy. And his argument was sort of that oil states don't join international organizations because people are willing to give them FDI no matter what, and sort of all those things. But it's definitely a good point. It's definitely something interesting to look at, how that history of conflict might affect it.
Melda, you had a point?
Yes. To start with, I think it is a very interesting paper because it is really focusing on something that has been overlooked in the literature, which is the interstate dynamics of oil-rich countries. I think in that sense, thank you very much, Anita. I have simply three main points to make. The first one is related with the private sector that you're talking about, because your assumption is really based on the role of private sector and how the private sector and public sector are differentiated in oil-rich countries. So depending on the Dutch disease, I understand the private sector is not as strong as other countries in oil countries, but I would highly recommend if you can actually make the differentiation in the private sector, because depending on Terry Carr's very recent paper, she is actually making a differentiation between oil-related private sector and private services private sector. And she says that the oil-related private sector is actually based on high level of capital and how these people have to know the technology and the know-how to change the dynamics in the country. So it might make a differentiation. Maybe these people are actually effective in the politics in these countries. So
whose paper is that? Who wrote that?
Terry Carr, 2007. It's a working paper from Stanford, and it's called Oil-Led Development.
Oil what?
Oil-Led Development. I can send it to you if you want to.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah. That was the first point. Should I continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The second thing I was thinking is related with the commercial peace thesis. You say in your paper that there are some counter arguments for this thesis. In the literature, And it is very robust, as you say, that trade interdependence actually it decreases the level of militarized conflict in the international relations. However, I think it would actually strengthen your theory if you can mention these counter-arguments in your theory a little bit, because as far as I know, these counter-arguments are not very limited. So I think if you can really justify why you think this is a very robust assumption, that would really increase your explanation. And the last thing I have as a comment is related with your case study. I think it's a really to-the-point case study, and it really supports your argument overall. But in your paper, you're also discussing Colgan's book, which is based on the assumption that the characteristics of like the leaders in Petro-States and their characters actually change the interstate dynamics. And as far as I know, Hugo Chavez is a very strong character too. So I think depending on that, you might want to explain why you think that it is not based on these characteristics, but based on the dynamics in the private sector that makes these changes in these two countries. So I think you might want to justify why it's not his characteristics. So these were the three things I was thinking.
Yeah.
Gabby would like to add to that really quickly before we go to Anita.
No, I just wanted to reinforce Melda's last point, because this was exactly what I thought when I found this super interesting. But the first thing, I wasn't really clear what we would need to see in a single case that would really confirm your argument. And then you went on for a long time talking about how things evolved under Chavez. But the problem is that if you look at your figure 3, oil dependence since the mid of the 1970s, they have about the same mean, and there is no real trend in oil dependence whatsoever, but you leverage about a lot of events coming in after the 2000s, and this has a lot to do, as you describe it, with A, the political institutions, and B, the specific character of Chavez. Both of them do not play a single role so far in your theory, and so I was wondering, I mean, I'm not so sure how this really supports your argument, and therefore I might,
So
you might want to...
No, so I have two things on that, and what was the first one that I was thinking of? One, I think there's sort of always a tension in the quantitative data in case studies, because case studies are going to bring out this nuance, right, that we can't fully represent in our large scale model. There's always this trade-off, and certainly I've thought a lot about the variation in this and institutions. So one thing that I've looked at and I haven't had a chance to include, but it's certainly something that I've preliminarily done, and I looked at the interaction of these things with I don't know, Getty's institutions, right? So she separates them into military and party and personalist. And so what you see from that is that, and I really wish I had those just to show you the graphs that I have for that, but you do see that in democracies, oil dependence doesn't seem to make a difference in conflict. In military governments, you don't get statistical significance. I think military governments are kind of all over the board with how they relate to the private sector in general. You see a really, really, really strong effect for the party systems, and and then personalist governments tend to be, it enhances conflict. Anyway, I'm still working on that. That's why I haven't written it up, but I definitely do think that. You see these. I definitely think institutions play a role, no doubt. I absolutely think that. I don't think institutions explain it. I think that institutions do alter this relationship, though, for sure.
Would you want to talk a little bit more about what it is that you're looking for in the case study? What is it about the case study that is in support or an attempt to falsify or whatever it is that you're trying to do with their case study?
In particular, and I think these studies, in some sense, as you guys have touched on, you know, we're still, you know, the best that I can do is, you know, use proxies for the size of the private sector, right? I'm still, for my dissertation, that's one of the chapters in my dissertation that I'm working on. There's no agreed upon measure for private sector size. There's this paper that came out by some economists in Africa recently using very country level data. And so it's a difficult proposition in many ways. A lot of qualitative scholars argue that, you know, business power can only be assessed qualitatively. But there are a lot of problems with that because that ends up being, you know, these case studies that don't necessarily speak to each other. And I'm also looking at different ways of looking at that too, right? So I think that we need the quantitative literature in order to show that these are overall forces, you know, controlling, you know, for these factors, that they're significant. But I think it is in the case studies that we see this actual relationship develop. I don't know if it's in the paper, but one of the interesting things from the Columbia side is they have a very close relationship between the private sector and the state. And when Chavez cuts off trade in 2005, the private sector calls up Yerbe, calls up his foreign minister, and you have to apologize. You have to fix this, right? We're losing money. And so within 2 weeks, Yerbe actually apologizes, right? And it's pretty out of character for Yerbe to do that. But he needs to do that to restore trade. And you see these in more instances as it goes in the future. You definitely have this private sector influence. At the same time, as this continues to go on, the Colombian government is trying to sign free trade agreements with a lot of other countries. So like in 2008-9 period, the one with the US finally goes through, the one to Korea, the Central Dyad. So there are several. But the problem was that those end up being commodity based, and this is really, you know, the manufacturing becomes a huge problem. But so you definitely see that on the Colombian side. After Chavez, though, used it like 10 times or something, you know, the private sector is certainly willing to support Yerbe in the 2009 clash, where Chavez cuts off trade because of the potential for U.S. Personnel to be using the military base. In fact, it's one of his almost weaker sort of excuses. And it sort of is the sense that, okay, he's just going to keep doing this. We can't forever capitulate to him. So I think, you know, I would definitely love to do more medium end research because, like I said, every case has a lot of variation, but it does give us some insight in the fact that the private sector, again, maybe this is on the Colombian side, so I can't remember how much is in the paper or at all, but the private sector does involve itself in security decision making. And that's important when we're thinking about economic interdependence and conflict.
Great. Andy, I want to apologize. I think I cut you off earlier. Did you have more questions that you wanted to, or comments you wanted to raise?
No, I just, you know, I was just thinking, looking at the table there are a lot of states, a lot of Petro-States that are not really war fighters. And a number of the ones that did fight conflicts were not industrial, and they were empowered to fight during those Cold War periods. And you know, Libya would be a good example, I think, where there's sort of a function of that period. And so I'm not sure, it seems like there's a lot of heterogeneity in the types of Petro-States. Like the the sort of domestic institutions, the militaries, the industrialization. Russia is very different than in Nigeria. So I'm kind of curious about that variation. So that was one thing. The other thing was the pricing that you mentioned in the conclusion. I'm not an economist, but I was curious, the sort of Chavez rise and fall with pricing, the leverage they have in foreign policy. I was curious about that. And I was also curious about energy trading between countries. That kind of interdependence I thought was very interesting and might be explored a little. I felt like the Petro-State concept was not fully defined. Like there was more that could be explored there because it wasn't a one-size-fit-all concept for these many states. Qatar is very different than Russia.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I want to go forward with. And basically, so I have this proposal I keep talking about medium end, but one specific thing is about looking at Petro-States in these institutions. I can't say for certainty. I think a lot of your examples do seem maybe to come from the Middle East, because certainly when we think of places like Russia or Venezuela, or I think even the Petro-States in Africa, I think you do mostly see them use military force. I have a totally unresearched hypothesis that it seems to me that monarchies in particular tend to be more peaceful of the oil states, but I'm not really sure. So that's something that I really want to look at.
Well, some of those, that's an interesting point, because some of those monarchies are artifacts of the period. So, the Egyptian monarchy, for instance, was an artifact of colonialism. So I think some of these trajectories of these Petro-States are a function of that.
To some extent, but also, you have Venezuela that's definitely outside of that.
Yeah, sure. So I think you might have a subset of these Petro-States that are better fits for your theory, and maybe it would be stronger because they have a business class and an economy, and it might be Venezuela-like, whereas Qatar that's very exceptional, very different kind of state. I don't even know if they have a military.
Sorry, I apologize. So is there something about the way in which the public sector or the private sector relates to the government or the government type of each of these states that is a better fit for your theory or not? Would that be another way of thinking about that? I've got two fingers from Curtis.
Yeah, just to build on this and going back to the previous question about political institutions, since you're essentially making an audience costs argument and talking about the way that oil insulates leaders from different domestic pressures, I really think it's important to disaggregate political institutions a little bit more, because business interests are going to matriculate up to leaders in different ways depending on the political institutions that we have. And there are large literatures on this that could strengthen your argument, I think.
Yeah, and I'm definitely looking into that and how to incorporate it. It's always difficult, to do, really researched and very carefully did the interpretation of the two-way interaction. It gets more complicated when we're interpreting effects of more and more interactions. But I definitely think that's true. I have another case study of just for my dissertation, China and Japan. That's nothing to do with this oil stuff, but even within democracies, certain types of democracies, it looks like, again, I haven't finished this case study, but that business interests might be stronger in China than they are in Japan. So there's definitely a lot of this institution variation that, yes, I agree to incorporate. It's hard to get all the nuance, though, without and to be able to feel confident in your interpretation of the model. So, but yes, I definitely will, look more into that and incorporate that as much as I can.
Curtis has a good point about this, is that maybe that you need to think about how it is that the public sector or the private sector interacts with the government. So it's less about different kinds of regime types or legislatures or whatever, but there's something about that access that maybe you could, that way you don't have to look at all institutions or all different types. You can kind of get focus on your theory. Melda had a point.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so kind of related with that, when I was reading, I totally understand talking about institutions in United States is not very easy because the literature is not really very clear about that. So I see your point, Anita. But also related with institutions, I think you might want to think a little bit more about what you mean by corruption, because that is also all over the place in the literature. I think you might want to, because you do mention in your case study that the corruption is a thing in Venezuela. So maybe the definition of corruption in Venezuela would be a thing to think about. So.
Yeah, and there's some interesting literature on that to think of. I mean, certainly corruption is something that you see in non-Petro-States as well. So, but yeah, definitely we'll look into that.
Gabby?
I have another point that is not completely related. One thing I have, I'm also not completely sure about is your distinction between going to war and the severity of war. So I'm not sure why the more oil dependence we have, the more deadly wars these states will fight. I mean, so I really don't, I mean, I understand that they should probably go to this hostile level, but then why do we differentiate further? Maybe I just misunderstood, but I mean, for me, it's like either they go to war or not, but how can we leverage the oil dependence for how bad
that's not, I think that's important, and I believe I discussed it some in the paper, trying to specifically how we're defining conflict. I mean, certainly this isn't about states that fully go to war, right? There's too few cases in the literature of actually going to war. So the literature has been focused on militarized disputes, right? Different levels of using military force. And the problem with the MID data set is that it can include everything from fishing boats, so then you see several MIDs between the United States and Canada on that basis. In an ideal world, what I would love, and people are starting to do this a little more, but it's difficult without having to go to every incident, different ways of, more of a process of conflict resolution. But these do give us an idea of whether they use the actual use of military force. And even then, the reason the hostility level is that there's still at least two levels of the use of military force. I cannot recall them offhand, but you have, military mobilizations, right? So that's a really important thing, because that's usually done with, that seriously, about that point is where you get a real chance of war or a real chance of conflict. And that's a big thing to, I think, to emphasize, is that in these conflicts short of war, the hostility level differs between whether these things are part of conflicts the states have and ones that actually might escalate. And so using, being more willing to use military force and higher levels of military force, I think that's why, looking at this degree of hostility, at least that was certainly my reasoning behind it. But that's why there also is the logit, which is a way of also measuring conflicts that actually use military force. And so that's the logit with fatalities.
Okay, but I think two things were not completely clear to me and still are not completely clear to me. So I understood that the logit is a MID with at least one fatality. That's what I understood. But I had really trouble understanding exactly what you do in the second type of regression analysis, both as I could not, I mean, you do not provide the equation, so it's a bit hard to understand really fully what the model is, but also the definition of the dependent variable was not completely clear to me, and then this is then also a theoretical problem as you simply talk about conflict or not, but not so much about different degrees of conflict, although to a large degree I understand your logic, but I think it might help the reader if you clarify this further in your paper. That's at least what was my reading on this.
Mm-hmm.
Curtis.
I'm not sure it was like, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to respond, Anita?
No, I'm not sure that I did, other than, yeah, to elaborate on that, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, to make a careful connection between what you're arguing about how it works and then the hostilities. Very well. Curtis?
Yeah, I want to stick with the results you produced for a moment, because one of the things that stuck out to me is both of your models, both of your interaction models indicate that among countries that are not major trading partners, higher oil dependence has a negative effect on the risk of conflict. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
The problem with interpreting the models that way, the models with interaction effects, is made way better by other people, but that one has to, basically, when that interaction is included, one has to be very careful about interpreting too much into those signs, and as well as, so God, basically there are like two articles that I do reference but maybe not point that out, that would caution against putting too much into that interpretation.
Gabby,
sure, you have to be
go ahead.
Sorry, you have to be careful when you interpret interaction terms in both the models. It's true, but your results
but also
do.
The other variable.
But yes, but the negative and significant coefficients on higher oil dependence indicate that when you have 0 for bilateral trade, which I think is going to be a lot of your dyads, you have a negative relationship, a significant negative relationship between oil dependence and interstate conflict.
Gabby?
Just on this, isn't oil dependence a part of the trade dependence? I mean, if a country exports a lot of oil to another country, this will show up both in the oil dependence and in the trade, no?
Well, I believe the oil dependence is not dyadic.
It must not, but I mean, if you have a country, I mean, I'm with
But they're
you,
not correlated. They're not correlated, and that's also why my argument isn't just about trade in oil, right? So you can have oil dependence even if all that oil you're consuming domestically.
Yeah, just for, I mean, it does not need to be correlated for all the times, but as you figure, I think 5 shows, for example, for the Venezuela-Colombian relationship in the 1980s, this was almost completely perfectly correlated because it was, I mean, it does not need to be all the times, but sometimes this might overlap. And I think, I mean, just to correctly specify the model, one might want to, I mean, I don't know whether this is possible at all, but in some sense, oil is, especially for countries that have a high oil dependence, most trade will be trade in oil, at least the exports, no?
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, certainly people have, and people are thinking about looking at, if you, looking at trade on the dyadic level, how much of that is oil. I mean, that's an interesting point. I think there is a lot of variation there, but that's an interesting point to look at.
And you could use that to leverage on your arguments.
So I think that the combination of Gabriele and Curtis's points are really important, which is that you're trying to gain inferential purchase by using this interaction term, and the constituent parts of the interaction term suggest that oil dependence works in the opposite direction that you're suggesting theoretically, when there's no trade dependence, and it's probably a lot of your observations. And then when there is trade dependence, so when that when we're actually looking at that interaction actually may not be as meaningful as you're suggesting it is, because it's actually a potentially correlated concept. Is that a correct accounting of the two of your comment about this? Okay. So you may be actually finding getting pressure against your argument, and then it may also be very difficult to kind of draw inferences. So it'd be interesting if you could talk about how you're identifying cause here.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, certainly Colgan has the same effect in his model. There really is this article that talks about how the other coefficients change when you're looking at interaction effects, and I just don't have it offhand, but that interpretation is maybe true, but it's not necessarily true. And I just have to go back and look at that article and maybe explain it better.
We are about at the end of our time, so if any of our discussants have any last minute points that they'd like to make, are we set?
I want to thank everyone. I mean, this was an awesome experience. I'm so happy about it. All your comments are really great, and certainly things to think about and improve, and just a lot of really useful stuff. So thank you for the time for reading it and thinking out, these comments and stuff, and I really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Good luck with the paper.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank everybody for participating again. Thank you, Anita, for submitting and presenting your paper and sharing it with us. Thank you to the discussants for volunteering your time to read the paper and think thoughtfully about it. Thanks especially to Gabriele, who stayed up late to work in order to be able to meet our time zone. Yeah, best of luck with this project. If anyone who's watching has comments or questions that they would like to address to Anita, they can post them on the Google Plus page or the YouTube page, and we will try to take a look at it, and hopefully Anita will keep an eye on it and see if there's anything we need to respond to. And if anyone came in late, you can back up and watch this presentation from the very beginning and see a presentation by Anita, or you can visit the online Peace Science Colloquium website, which is available from the Colloquia tab on the Peace Science Society website, and read the paper and review the presentation and learn more about us and what we do. I'd like to remind everybody that the next meeting of the online Peace Science Colloquium will be in 2 weeks on Friday the 23rd, and we'll have a presentation from Meredith Brink at the University of Michigan on state allocation of force in civil conflict. So yeah, thank you everybody for watching and participating. And,
thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.